Well, with today's video, we have the opportunity to jump into the Belgic Confession, the first couple of articles, and learn a little bit more about where this confession of faith is leading us in terms of its explanation of Christian teaching. We're going to look at the first two articles in this video. They deal with the doctrine of God and how we know God. And with these particular articles, I'll read the whole thing. I won't necessarily do that each time, but these articles are fairly short, and so they lend themselves to us being able to read them together. So, first of all, Article 1. Article 1 talks about the fact that there is only one God. We all believe in our hearts and confess with our mouths that there is a single and simple spiritual being whom we call God, eternal, incomprehensible, invisible, unchangeable, infinite, almighty, completely wise, just, and good, and the overflowing source of all good. What's notable, I think, about this article is just the fact that it points us to the one true God and the fact that there is only one God. But it also points us to the fact that there is a God, that we are not alone in the universe and that we are not supreme in our worlds or even in our own lives. Once we say that there's a God, we're saying that there's some being in the universe to whom we in some way are responsible. And certainly you can't have the Christian faith without acknowledging in some sense that there is a God. Now, the fact that there's a God doesn't necessarily get you to the Christian God. As James writes, even the demons believe that there is a God, but they shudder. So we need to say more than that, but we need to say at least the fact that there is a God. Now, I think in our world, many people would acknowledge that there's some sort of a God, but what strikes me is the words of Psalm 14, which begins, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And that psalm goes on to talk about the effects of living as if there is no God. And where the Belgic Confession, I think, is helpful is that it points us to the fact that we have to confess this because there is something in all of us that wants to be our own masters, wants to be in charge of our own destiny. And maybe we don't say that out loud. Maybe we are not the militant atheists who are loudly proclaiming that there is no God, and in fact, teaching about God is only destructive to human nature. But I think even for those who would confess out with our mouths that there's a God, we need to be reminded that this is something that we need to own in our hearts as well. And so we start with this teaching. There is a God, and we are not God. And then we move on to Article 2. Article 2 discusses the means by which we know God. We know him by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe. Since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God. His eternal power and divinity, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans 1, verse 20. All these things are enough to convict men and to leave them without excuse. Second, he makes himself known to us more openly by his holy and divine word, as much as we need in this life, for his glory and for the salvation of his own. What this article tells us is that there are different ways of knowing God, and this is not saying, as some relativists would put it, that all paths lead to God, but it's saying that the one true God is known by various ways in this world. As Christians, we often think about the reality of God's revelation of himself in the Bible, in the book that he's given to us. And as the Belgic Confession makes clear, the book is certainly the primary way, the clearest way that God has set forth who he is and what he's done for us. However, there are other ways to see the work of God in the world as well, and one of those is through creation. When we talk about creation, we can talk about the beauty and the wonder of this world that God has made and how intricately it all holds together. Think about something like the Grand Canyon, or think about something like the creation of the human body, and how all the different systems, all the different creatures that we see in the world, the petals on a flower even, all of these things are so intricately designed. This article really pushes back against the evolutionary mindset of this world. Now, it's not confessing a certain way in which the world was created, but it does tell us that there is a design, there's a designer, and we can't, when we look at the world, we can hardly avoid that conclusion. It takes as much faith to assume that this world didn't have a designer as the idea that it did. And so the confession quotes Romans chapter 1. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that all men are without excuse. And again, what we see here is an answer to the question, well, what about those who don't have a chance to read the Bible? Where do they get their information about God? And the confession quotes the Bible as saying, there's enough information about God and about God's character in this world that those who see, who have their eyes open to this, ought to be asking questions about who this God is, even without necessarily having the Bible, so that it leads them to this revelation of God in the book and in Jesus Christ. Paul goes on in Romans chapter 2. He's going to say a little bit more about this as well. He says in Romans 2, verse 14, when those who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. Since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. And again, we see that there is something innate in the human heart that says that there is right and wrong. Now, we sometimes disagree about what the right and wrong is, but the very fact that there's a sense of right and wrong tells us that we have some kind of outside authority that we recognize that we have to answer to, even if we aren't always clear in our hearts about what that looks like. And so what we want to see in these first two articles is this teaching about God, this call for us and really in our witness to the world to see that we are witnessing to a being who is in control of this world, a being who is good, who is loving, who is caring, who is powerful, who is eternal, and who invites us then into a relationship in which we can know and love and serve this one true God. And that will lead us next week into more of what we talk about with the doctrine of revelation, with how God reveals himself through the Bible, and we'll get into that the next time in our next video. So thanks for watching. I hope that this is helpful as we think about what it means for us to confess with all our heart, with our mouth, what we believe about the one true God, and to push us to think about how do we serve and love and respond to this God who invites us into relationship with him.